I first met Ursula Graham-Bauer when I was doing a project on the Nagas. I'd obviously, as a young man, I think perhaps even at school, I'd read her very famous book, Naga Path. It was one of the most popular second-hand books in Britain. Every bookshop you went into in the 1960s had Naga Path. And I'd read that book and I'd heard about her from others. Ursula took some of the very early colour film, how she got it. Her first film is black and white, which is mainly about crafts, about weaving and things like this, pottery. And then she went away, and then she came back, and then I think from the American forces, probably, again, her personality was no doubt part of the story. She managed to inveigle them to give her some of this precious, expensive colour film, which was just coming on the market. And so she took over an hour of film of poisoning fish and dragging stones and dances and so on. And this is some of the really earliest good ethnographic film. Certainly some of the earliest in that area. And she also filmed among the Apatanis when she went for another part of field work. Now you have to remember how little good film survives from that period. If you think of all the great British anthropologists who were founding the discipline at that time, not a single one, as far as I know, apart from Heimendorf, and he was filming a little later after the war, none of them filmed. I mean, you'd think they would, because Haddon had gone out in 1898 and made the first ethnographic film, but it just was too expensive, too difficult. There were many reasons why you shouldn't and couldn't film. And undergraduate students or PhD students of that time or field workers would be told, no, don't think about it. All the manuals for anthropology said, don't think about it unless you've got a lot of money, a lot of time. Do it as a separate expedition because you haven't got time to both be an anthropologist and a filmmaker. Ursula hadn't read these books, and she just went and did it.
Right from her childhood, very early on, Ursula's mother sent her to live with her grandmother, who was known as Humpus. And she'd lived in India in the past, and they'd had to return because of illness. But she lived with Humpus, and she joined a big family in Droxford, where Ursula's aunt and her children were, and they all grew up together with a big background of visiting alpha males in the family. And they told their stories of derring do. They were pioneers. Hamilton Bower had done early Tibetan trips to map the area. So she grew up with these stories, and in the absence of her mother and occasional visits from her father, she'd love nothing more than going out, learning to shoot, hunting and fishing, and she always had that spirit. At one point she said that she bitterly resented that I was not a boy. She said, I remember bursting into floods of tears at the age of 3, being quite inconsolable on discovering I couldn't follow my father into the Navy. She wanted to do that, and I think from early on too she realised that it was going to be down to her to make her own good luck.
It was always in her blood to grab adventure. By the time they moved en famille to Weymouth, she was dyed in the wool bower. Ursula had been sent to Rodin, where she thrived. However, her life was soon to be turned upside down. Just a term or so before she was due to matriculate, the family decided there wasn't enough money for her education to go on. She was devastated to have to leave mid-term and was too embarrassed to own up as to why she had to go.
Strangely, after she was taken out of education, the family found sufficient funds to send her to finishing school in Switzerland.
The life of a debutante in London did not suit Ursula at all, and she would escape to wilder regions of Britain as often as she could.
She'd drive up to Scotland. The Bowers were a Scottish family. So she'd take herself off on holidays and go walking among the archaeological sites. Archaeology was her passion and her great interest.
Ursula loved her driving holidays to Scotland among the archaeological sites, and it was on one such visit to Skye in 1937 that she met Alexa MacDonald. They became firm friends, and after her return to London, she received a life-changing invitation to join Alexa on the adventure she longed for, a trip to Kohima, capital of Nagaland.
And we started out into thick jungle, really thick, low country jungle. Huge walls of great straight trees on either side, all straining up for the daylight, and creepers and things tangled in between. I was fascinated. I'd never seen the like of it. And then suddenly the road began to climb, and it was just zigzag, zigzag, zigzags the whole way, right up, up and up and up. And there were streams and cliffs down to the right of us. The road swept out to the edge and swept up the next bit, and streams tumbling down, great cliffs, real mountain scenery, but jungle scenery. And we went on and on. Then we came clear of the low-ground forest, the thick forest, the real jungle. And we came up into much more open country, but still mountains, still climbing. And we'd done, I suppose, about 40-odd miles. We must have been about the 44th mile, when we came round a corner, and walking down the road towards us were 4 men. And I took one look at them. Something hit me. And I said, "Lexi, for goodness sake, who are those?" And she looked very surprised. She said, "Nagas." And I thought, Nagas? Just about, of course. And I could not think. It went clean out of my mind. What did I know about Nagas? Where had I seen Nagas? And I don't know what it was real déjà vu. But it just disappeared as soon as it had hit me. And they were Angamis, all in full fig, wearing these short black kilts with bands of cowrie shells, and bare torsos with great strings of beads. Just one look and they were gone. And I was left with my head fairly going round, wondering what on earth had happened to me. I knew Nagas. I was certain I knew Nagas. Nagas were Nagas. I just didn't know where I was. And then we came out at the top into Kohima, where we had breakfast, and I looked out over that country, and once again the whole thing seemed familiar. It belonged. But how, I just do not know.
She had possibly heard the name Naga, and as she got closer, people probably said, "You will meet the Nagas." But she didn't have any picture of them, which is what makes the real excitement of her account of encountering them, because when she met them, she should have been entirely surprised and shocked by them, and she was on one level. The other, as she famously describes, she'd felt she'd known them all her life. Now, those of us who believe we've been reincarnated several times think that, of course, she had been a Naga princess sometime earlier. The double irony of the whole situation was that she felt she'd been with the Nagas before, and she recognized them. She felt entirely relaxed and at home. Meanwhile, the Nagas who met her felt the same thing about her, because there had been a famous lady called Gaidelu, who was a prophetess, a millenarian cult in that part of Nagaland, which was causing trouble to the British by asking for some form of independence. So the British had shoved Gaidelu away in prison, probably in Calcutta or somewhere. But before she went, she sensibly said, "Well, they'll lock me up, but someone else will come who is really me, in disguise, heavy disguise." So when this upper middle class young lady turned up and said, "Oh, I've known you all my lives," they said, "Ah, you must be Gaidelu." So she actually became a millenarian cult figure to the Nagas. I mean, she didn't lead a rising against the British or anything, but they felt she was someone special, and she felt they were something special. So it was complete accident, and yet the destiny was told in the stars. These are, again, Zemi Nagas, and they look as if they've been on a hunting expedition. This is where she filmed her best film of the river and also the dragging of the stone. See the huge wood supplies which you have also in Nepal where I work. This is, you see, a very good bit of filming. She's realised that if you let people walk across the screen like that, it's rather effective, and just keep the camera still. Many people will be tempted to follow them, and this is more kind of Bergman-esque filming, just letting the feeling of long processions with heavy loads of wood.
I'm impressed at the way this is early filming she's doing. She really goes in quite close on her subjects, which is nice.
This is Catriona Child, one of Ursula's daughters who lives in New Delhi, India. She is currently working on an agricultural project with some of the descendants of the Nagas that her mother captured on film in the 1930s. She is speaking to us over the internet whilst watching some of this footage.
Yes, I'm looking at this very tranquil scene of the European ladies learning to do Naga dances. Ursula's not in this lineup of European ladies. I'm sure she's filming. It may include Alexa, who was Ursula's great friend, who invited her to Manipur in the first place and gave her the chance to have this adventure. And I suspect that this was probably quite early on in Ursula's contact with this part of the world. It may have been her first trip. But although she enjoyed her first 3 weeks in Manipur, living the colonial lifestyle and having drinks on the verandas and tea at the governor's house and watching the polo and all the other things that European ladies of that time did, she did start to get restless, and she had already on the way up to Manipur fallen in love with the jungle. It had struck a spark with her. And after that, there was no turning back. She says that she got back from the sweat, the tiredness, the clambering up slippery slopes and falling down the other side, all the discomfort, but also the intoxicating beauty and wilderness of the jungle and the hills and the people who lived there.
So I was absolutely thrilled to meet her, because it was clear from the book and what I'd heard from my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, the great Naga expert, one of the great Naga experts, who knew her and spoke very highly of her. It was clear that she was a formidable and outstanding woman.
Somehow it propelled ourselves into the Second World War and the Japanese advancing from Burma.
So we were put there with tribal watch posts to check anybody using the hills without passes. And they were not supposed to fight, they were simply there to stop unauthorized passers. And the idea was that if things got nasty and things got dangerous, a British officer would be sent to take over from me. But meantime, as they trusted me, I was to recruit them and try and run them in. And this went on quite successfully until the Japs came in March 1944. Somebody was sent out to back me up because the British officers, it was mostly operating, like my husband, who was also in it, on the Chinwin and along the front. They'd all been overrun. Half of them were trying to walk out. There was no one to come and take my place. However, HQ down at 14th Army sent me a signal telling me to get out and get out quick. Well, this took a little time to arrive. Meantime, a company of troops had arrived and were looking for the Japs, and I set out to guide them with some of my scouts. And I sent a cable saying, going forward to look for the enemy, kindly send rifles and ammunition soonest. And this crossed with the wire telling me to get out. And when it arrived at V-Force HQ, Colonel Scott, my OC, clapped his bush hat on his head, looked at my signal, which was quite unintentionally pure Nelson, and rushed round to see Slim, slapped the telegram on the desk, and said, "From Miss Bower, sir." Slim looked at it and said, "We must support her."
And towards the end of this time, or sometime when you were actually filming with your movie camera, you came across the sort of conflict that anthropologists often have between being participants and being observers. You were observing with your camera, but you were also watching a huge rock being pulled in. What happened when you...
Well, of course, it was part of the stone dragging ceremony, and the rule is to drag a stone downhill or along the level. They put it on a kind of sledge, and they get a great team on. They can get 300 men on if the country's right. There's enough room, pulling on cane ropes. And it's done by everybody pulling together. There's a cheerleader who sort of says 1, 2, 3, and on the last 3 they all heave till they get it moving, and then they just walk away with it, more or less. Well, this one was built into a kind of scaffolding, flat scaffolding. It's a big stone, 7 foot by 5, and about that thick. I don't know what it weighed. And they had this scaffolding built round it, a flat scaffolding, with poles this way, and the men get round it on a solid block, there were 80 on this one, and carry it on their shoulders. And they've got 2 cane ropes out behind with a team on them, and 2 cane ropes in front again with a team on, which are used for braking and steering. And how they got it across that country, I don't know. But I was filming it. I was going ahead, walking ahead of it, and then watching this crowd coming along. The ground was so rough that not more than a quarter of them could have been taking the weight at the same time. The others were all just hanging on, trying to keep their feet. The thing was tilting this way and that, this way and that. Everybody chanting and yelling. And it was a stupendous scene. They looked just like a solid mass of ants carrying an enormous grasshopper, a very large grey grasshopper. And then the going got worse and worse. And suddenly the stone, they lost control. And the whole lot went careering down the steepening hillside into the jungle. People being knocked off their feet. There was obviously the thing was coming over into the middle of the crowd, and there was going to be a most ghastly accident. Well, at that moment I dropped everything. I may say I was carrying everybody's necklaces. People who didn't want their necklaces broken with the poles on their shoulders. I was wearing about 3 people's necklaces and carrying cloths, and using a movie camera, and my Leica slung around me. I hurled all these down underneath a tree, and I and 3 or 4 small boys, the old headman who was a spectator, grabbed one of the rear anchor ropes, and we were dragged down the slope, very nearly sitting down behind this stone, and then the old headman and I managed to get the rope round a tree and hang on like grim death, and we anchored it a bit, we belayed it. Somebody managed to get the other anchor rope round another tree once the thing was checked, and everybody regained their feet and managed, after a most fearful struggle, to get it back onto the path. Well, by that time, and by the time I'd picked up the camera and picked up everything else, got my breath and gone on ahead, and dusted most of the mud off the seat of my shorts, because I had been definitely towed down the slope along with the headman. We were in the village, and I was just there in time to film the final stage of it being carried in.
So you're both a participant and an observer.
I must be, I think, the only lady anthropologist who has ever actually dragged a monolith.
This is an extraordinary bit of footage, I think, and as Alan's described in his interview, it's where Ursula becomes a participant and not only an observer. And I think actually it must have been quite terrifying at the time, because I've seen those slopes and they are precipitous. And to think of a vast stone of goodness knows what tonnage potentially careering by itself down one of those slopes with hundreds of people surrounding it is a very scary thought. I have seen the results of the stone dragging at Lysong village. In the old part of the village, that there are a series of gravestones laid down. And when I go there, I look at them and I wonder which was the one that was being dragged in this section of film. And in the same place, in Lysong, in that same area, as well as the old gravestones, there is also the site of the Hazoa, which was the jumping stone. And particularly in Zemi society, this was the most sacred and special part of the village. This was where the heads were buried after they'd been taken on a headhunting raid. And at certain festivals, they would have athletic competitions, which would probably include wrestling and mock spear fights and the long jump. And the Hazoa stone stood 1.5 feet above the ground, 1 foot to 1.5 feet, and they would take off at the Hazoa stone and jump as far as they could into probably some fairly soft earth at the end. And the Zemi practiced a thing called cycle migration, and when they moved to another village site and set up a whole new system where they would stay and cultivate the land for perhaps 10 or 20 years, they would set up a Hazoa stone in that new place. And that, in the same way that they talk about the fire being the heart of the house, I think the Hazoa stone was the heart of the village.
I suspect if you took this film back, they'd say, oh, well, actually, I've seen it on YouTube, because quite a lot of my stuff is now on YouTube and bits of this film, but there's a lot that isn't, obviously. People are fascinated, usually, because memory is much better. There's much less movement. So if you took a film back to a village where it had been taken 70, 80 years ago in this country, they'd say, oh, well, it's all changed. There's no one I know. But in these cases, they probably would say, oh, that must be my great-grandfather or my grandfather. And, oh, I remember that street or house or whatever. So it actually means something. And I think one of the obligations, really, of anthropologists now is to return this material to the people about whom it was taken. For many years, it wasn't possible. There was only one copy, and it was in an archive. Now, it's just becoming possible in this virtual world to put all the material up on one place, and then the Nagas and everyone else who wants to can see it.
Goodbye, Mrs. Bees. Goodbye, Mrs. Bees. if I don't see you anymore. Goodbye, Cornwall, this